Well, good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this special live stream discussing the so-called Respect for Marriage Act. I'm Mike Andrews. I'm the communications director at Center for Christian Virtue. And really what we wanted to do today with this bill looking like it's poised to become law here in the next few weeks, we needed to take a moment just to talk with you through how we got to this point, what's ahead, and what we can expect in terms of religious freedoms issues because of this bill that's being passed through. It has passed the Senate, being sent back to the House for their approval as well. Before we get started today, if I could, I'd like to take just a moment to pray for our time together. Gracious Heavenly Father, we are so thankful for this opportunity to come together to seek encouragement and wisdom as we face this new wrinkle in our society. We know that this legislation has not caught you off guard. You are not surprised. You have put us in this place for a moment such as this. We pray for wisdom to navigate the challenges ahead. And we pray for your grace to be able to represent your name well as we push back against something that we think is against your word and your design. Help us to be loving, help us to be kind, but ultimately help us to be grounded in the truth of your word and in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Thank you so much again for this opportunity. May the people who are participating be blessed in your name. Amen. Well, as we get started here today, I'd like to welcome in our two featured guests. We have Center for Christian Virtue President Aaron Baer joining us this morning, and I'm also pleased to welcome in Roger Severino. He's the Vice President for Domestic Policy at the Heritage Foundation. And gentlemen, thank you so much for taking time this morning to have this very important conversation.
Hey, thanks, Mike, for hosting.
My pleasure. Well, Roger, if I can, I'd like to start with you. And can you just kind of give us the overview of what this bill is? I'm going to assume that most of our participants this morning know a little bit about the background of the Respect for Marriage Act, but just in case, can you kind of bring us up to speed on what this bill is and what its intention is?
It was a sneak attack on people of faith. When we thought the debate was over what a man and a woman mean, all of a sudden, what marriage is came back to the center of American life. The Democrats, because they are wily and good at the game of politics, sprung this bill, gave it about 27 hours of debate, and some Republicans voted for it in the House and caught the marriage movement off guard. Now, you said God was not surprised, but a lot of the movement was. It took months of fighting. We organized, we coalesced, and exposed the threat to religious freedom. The pretext is that somehow the benefits and legal protections that same-sex couples have after Obergefell would be at risk, which is nonsense. That would be a generational fight to be able to undo Obergefell. So it's not any real risk, certainly not anytime soon. So what was the point of doing it? Well, they wanted to treat people who oppose same-sex marriage and stand for natural man-woman marriage, treat them as equivalent to racists. So in this bill, they say that the federal government must recognize same-sex marriage across the states and interracial marriage. Now, nobody is advocating against interracial marriage. This was all done to put same-sex marriage on the same plane, and it sets the stage for persecution of people of faith. So this bill created a private right of action, which means a license to sue. So anybody who has an activist who has a claim that they had something that they prefer with same-sex marriage that is being denied by an institution of faith, they could now sue. And more dangerously down the road, what this sets in motion is a national policy that can be used by the IRS and the 87,000 agents Biden wants to hire to go after the tax-exempt status of religious schools and religious institutions. Additionally, you have adoption agencies who are threatened with losing their licenses because of their ties with government action. Anywhere that a faith group cooperates with the government can now be at risk being deemed a state actor, and if their views on same-sex marriage differ from the government's, they could lose their ability to work with the government. That's where this is going. The Democrats and the few 12 Republicans who are on board with this knew it because they were informed. Senator Lee had a alternative amendment based on the First Amendment Defense Act that would have addressed the religious freedom issues that I just highlighted. They refused to adopt it. They knew it with their eyes open. They knew full well it was during a lame duck session, and they need to be held accountable.
Sure. Well, a lot to unpack there. If I could, can we just kind of step back in time a little bit and consider, like, how did this amendment or this bill get to this point? Because I recall hearing about different versions of it earlier on. They never got a lot of traction. And as you said, this bill kind of came together in the wee hours of the morning, kind of a 27-hour turnaround, as you said. So how did we get to this point, especially with Obergefell already having been decided and already kind of creating the law of the land as far as same-sex marriage goes? Why did this bill come about now?
Yeah, it was politics. The Democrats saw, and the LGBT left saw an opportunity, and they took it. So Justice Thomas wrote a concurrence in the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe that rightly said that substantive due process, which is what got us Roe v. Wade and a lot of other terrible decisions, should be revisited. Now, one of the decisions that was based on substantive due process was the Obergefell decision, which he called out. That was one voice on the Supreme Court that said we should revisit these. And all the other justices in the majority said this was just limited to abortion. So there's no real prospect of this being actually litigated. However, the left took advantage of this to say, wow, you're right, same-sex couples are somehow at risk. What are the odds that Obergefell will be overturned versus the IRS going after institutions of faith? It's very near zero on one side and real insignificant on the other. In 1964, when Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, it took the IRS 6 years before they went after institutions of faith over their race policies. Now, race policies are one thing, right? We had a civil war over race, but to equate people who stand for man-woman marriage as equivalent to those same racists is what this is about. And that's how the bill was structured. And given the fight we put up after the House vote, again, many people were caught off guard. There was a movement among Collins and a couple other folks to try to give at least lip service to religious freedom. So one important thing there is they acknowledge the problem, right? Even the folks on the left say, yes, there's a real threat to religious freedom on tax-exempt status, et cetera. Problem is they didn't actually do anything legally effective, right? It was empty gestures. And we pointed out to them how they're empty. We did the legal analysis and they ignored it. They unfortunately had some cover. They had a couple scholars and you had folks with the LDS Mormon Church, the National Association of Evangelicals. You had just enough where those 12 Republicans thought they had enough cover. So we need folks to stand up for the biblical principles of marriage. We need people to stand up for the anthropological principles, the legal principles, right? We have to constantly remind people. When I briefed the Senate staffers, almost like 50 staffers on this issue, I asked by a show of hands how many people had received a briefing on marriage. There were 1 or 2 hands out of the near 50, right? We have to go back to re-inform people of what marriage is and why it's important. You know, it's there because we need to take men and women united and turn them into husband and wife so they could be the father and mother for any children that their union creates, right? When a child is born in this world, the mother's always nearby. There's no guarantee the dad's going to be nearby. So we need to have our social structures support that. And the best structure is marriage between a man and a woman. And any departure from that ideal hurts it and ends up hurting children. So we have to repeat that. And if we are pushed back, then we have to also fight for religious freedom. But we can't ever forget the starting principle of it all.
Sure.
Roger, if I can real quick just chime in here, I want to drill in a little bit more on what you said, because obviously in Ohio, we have both of our senators in Ohio voted for this, Sherrod Brown and Senator Rob Portman, and no surprise in Sherrod Brown, quite frankly. Senator Rob Portman, I'll admit, I was surprised that he went along with this, not because I'm surprised he supports same-sex marriage. We have had that conversation multiple times. But in all of the conversations I ever had with Senator Portman, the conversation was he supports same-sex marriage, but he also supports religious freedom. It's why he never went along with the Equality Act, for example, was the issues there with religious freedom. Can you talk about, because what his office and what he is saying to folks is, no, there were, you kind of alluded to this, there were religious freedom protections in there. Can you talk about what the bill they ultimately passed did say, and then break down why that's not sufficient, why we needed the Lee Amendment?
Okay, so they made gestures to religious freedom. To think that they were robust or to say that they were sufficient is either naive or they don't understand or they're in on it. So here's what the bill said. First, there was a statement of fact section that said diverse beliefs about gender and marriage deserve appropriate levels of respect. That says nothing, right? They dare not say man-woman marriage, conjugal marriage, biblical marriage. They didn't say that at all. And we called them out on it. They didn't change it. Right? You can't, words matter. And they chose those words very carefully. In another part in the statement of fact, they called out same-sex marriage by name and said people in those relationships deserve to have the rights and benefits, et cetera, et cetera. They know how to do it. They chose not to. Why? Because they didn't want to actually give the respect to man-woman marriage that it deserves. It's the only explanation. Why would you not when you're called out on it? Okay, so that's the first point. They don't even make the gesture at all. Now, here are the empty gestures. They say that the bill says it won't force a house of worship or religious institution to solemnize or celebrate a marriage. True. Okay, thanks. That's no big deal. We have the First Amendment. We know that the government cannot force a pastor or rabbi or imam to bless a same-sex union in their house of worship. If the First Amendment means anything, especially with this Supreme Court, that is not a risk. So thank you. Thanks for nothing. That doesn't give us anything. That does nothing to help where the action really is. And that's with the bakers, the florists, the web designers, Baer and Stutzman. Those are the folks that are being hounded out of business. They're not religious institutions. They're religious people who want to bring their faith into their life. And they're being forced to celebrate same-sex unions, right? So there's really, it's a red herring that they're addressing. Second, they say that they're not explicitly taking away any religious freedom protections. Okay, thanks. Again, it could have been far worse. It could have been like the Equality Act, which is far worse, which now they've pivoted to, because this opens a door. This is another brick in that wall, and people of faith are going to be on the other side of it and outside, right? They're building it brick by brick and saying, we're not building a wall. We're just stacking bricks, right? We know what's going on. This is another giant brick they've added. And when they say we're not taking away religious freedom arguments here, you don't need to. You're pushing the dirty work onto the IRS and others by empowering them to do it. They say that the bill, by its own operation, doesn't take away the tax-exempt status. That's true. We never said it did. Again, it could have been far worse and said you hereby lose your tax-exempt status, but that's not how the law works. You don't need that. It's a national policy they're setting. You're being equivalent to racists, and that's all the IRS really needs. I mean, do we trust the IRS agents under Biden to look at this rule of construction and say, oh, that means our hands are tied? No, because the bill doesn't say your hands are tied. The Senator Lee bill does. It says, IRS, you cannot, no matter what, take away the tax-exempt status of people who, by name, believe in man-woman marriage. Very simple, 2 sentences. They refuse to adopt it.
Yeah, Roger, I'm wondering, can you, or do you have any insight kind of behind the curtain of this bill obviously needed bipartisan support to pass, and 12 Republicans came on board. None of them were influenced by those amendments that seem to be pretty common sense as far as what you're saying for religious freedom. So I can kind of get my mind around somebody saying, socially, I support same-sex marriage, even if I'm privately against it. Like politically, I can see the benefit in doing this for same-sex couples, but yet not fighting for those religious freedom guarantees and protections. How did this all come to be that the bill pretty much skated through as it was written without any of these additions being included?
They acknowledge the problem. So the Senate version does something for religious freedom, but it is grossly inadequate. So the fact that they acknowledged it is a modicum of progress. The problem is they use that acknowledgement as cover to do the bad main thing of equating same-sex marriage and interracial marriage on the same plane, which is the greater threat to religious freedom, right? So they ended up making religious freedom worse. And we had 48 votes for the FADA Senator Lee amendment. That was a good sign that if we have a new Senate and a couple more senators and a president that's willing to sign it, which President Trump pledged to sign FADA, and Governor DeSantis, as a member of Congress, co-sponsored FADA. So if we get a president and a couple more senators in, then we're in business where we could actually have real religious freedom. Now, why particular Republicans ignored it and didn't care enough, that's on their consciences, but we should not forget, a couple of those senators were on the way out. Blunt and another were not returning to Congress. And others, some on Values Action Team, Senator Ernst, Senator Sullivan, Young, Portman. It's hard to figure out what in the world was going through their head. Maybe they care more about the approval of the world because they've got a bill that says they're in favor of same-sex marriage when it was absolutely unnecessary, because same-sex couples aren't at any appreciable threat of losing any of the benefits they currently enjoy. So it was really done to pour salt in the wound, reopen a battle, and to put a target on people of faith. That is actually what was accomplished.
What do you see as next steps for people of faith here, Roger, with this alleged target on our back now because of this bill? How do we live out our faith specifically in terms of how it applies to marriage?
Boldly. So keep standing up for faith. Keep living your beliefs, being willing to pay a price. If people aren't willing to pay a price, then we're going to lose by default. It will go to the courts because this bill, we're presuming it's going to pass, because it's going to go back to the House. So let's presume it's going to pass. It will empower people to sue. And especially if you have any close tie with government as a contractor or working with shelters, adoption agencies, that sort of thing. That's the one that's most at risk. And then the tax exempt question would be farther down the line. It took 6 years for the IRS to move after the 64 Act. So we have to fight. Of course, Beto O'Rourke has said, move now, right? He said, take away the tax exempt status. So we have to fight in public opinion and say, look, this would be a horrendous thing to go after institutions of faith because of their views on marriage. And if we have the right people in the next Congress and the next president, it could be an absolute game changer. So we have to look forward to those things too.
Yeah, Roger, I think that's such a huge point about where we go from here, in the sense of, I remember actually when Obergefell came down, there was do churches get out of the marriage business, right? Do churches stop issuing marriage license and things like that? And thankfully the overwhelming response is no, we don't. And I think that's the thing here is that we don't use this as a moment of fear, as pulling back. We know stuff we work on at CCB every day, of ministries that either get government grants to help addicted people or low income people, and we're having to pour through these contracts to make sure they're not being forced to put men in their women's domestic violence, battered women's shelter rooms, things like that. There are these things are happening right now, but I think the biggest thing, our encouragement is we don't shrink back from times like this, and actually we just prepare for the persecution to come and make sure that when that lawsuit comes, we're prepared, we are above board. We're able to tell a good story, and this is where I think from a messaging side, this puts us on a much better ground of, why do we care about religious freedom, and why does religious freedom matter to the people? Well, in part, it's because it's religious freedom that allows us to do good for our community. And so if government, the reality is, if government wants to come start shutting down these adoption agencies, these homeless shelters, these Christian schools, government is going to necessarily have to grow more, and is going to have to do things that that the church is far better equipped to do, that these ministries are far better equipped to do. And whether or not you agree with us that, some Jewish guy 2,000 years ago died and rose again for the salvation of our sins, you should be glad that we think that, because that compels us to do so much good, and love community. I really think it's important people understand this, that there are groups marching under the banner of Christianity, of evangelicalism, of Catholicism, that are actually opposing sort of religious freedom right now. Can you talk through some of the groups that were actually pulling against us, just so folks understand that this is real right now?
Well, the biggest disappointment were some faith groups that opposed effectively, they didn't say they opposed the Lee Amendment. They opposed stopping the bill without the Lee Amendment, right? So that was a condition we said was appropriate. Don't let the bill go through without the Lee Amendment, at the very least, right? Terrible bill. It shouldn't exist at all. But if it's going to go through, and you say you stand for religious liberty, add a true religious liberty protection. And faith groups, the National Association of Evangelicals, LDS Mormon Church, they said, this is good enough. We're fine. And they're going farther. They want to actually push towards the Equality Act as a next step, which, you want a target on the back. This is like a nuclear bomb. The Equality Act would unleash every single activist on people of faith, wherever they may be in the public square, because it covers public accommodation, schools, employment. The whole gamut would be covered under the Equality Act, and there will not be sufficient religious liberty protections. It is not a winning strategy to say, yes, it is entirely bigoted to say that same-sex relations are not equivalent to man-woman relations, right? That's a bigoted view, but let us be bigots because of our idiosyncratic faiths. That's not a winning long-term posture. We have to fight on the merits of the question, on human embodiment, how we are created, right? And always speaking out of love, but when we speak the truth, we're speaking the truth in love. Right? That matters. It matters for society. There's public policy reasons why that understanding of human embodiment. Because look what happened after same-sex marriage. It was, that slippery slope was a cliff. We went straight from what is marriage to what is a man and a woman. And we'd be naive to think that they are not absolutely related. And it's generally people of faith who are the ones standing up first and strongest for the truth about human flourishing. We have to keep fighting, even when you have people who also take the mantle of faith and claim it and proclaim it when they end up undermining people of faith and the truth of the matter.
Well, Roger, we want to be respectful of your time. We did have one question come in from our friend, Pastor Jeff Haygood. I think it's a good one that I'd like to ask you. And he's just asking, the media is reporting this as a done deal, but is there any chance it doesn't become law? And if not, what would be the circumstances that would keep that from happening?
Minimal, because Democrats were in favor of the bill control the House, and it left the Senate. It's very tough to see a way to stop it at this point.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much for all of your insight this morning. It's been very helpful. And again, we really appreciate your time. And thanks again for joining us and giving us this vital perspective as part of this conversation.
Thank you.
Well, now it's going to be my turn to put Aaron Baer on the hot seat. And Aaron, just for our audience, you and I were talking about this the other day. Can we just answer the question, why do we care? Why do we care about this specifically? Because there is that cultural momentum that would say, just as Roger was mentioning, like you kind of have these backwards, antiquated beliefs about marriage. Get on board, and you can do whatever you want in the privacy of your own mind, in your own home, in your own place of worship. Just keep it out of the public square. Why are we speaking up and speaking out about this issue?
Yeah, Mike, I think that's for the church right now. I think that's the conversation we need to be having, because we need to really ask, how did we get to this point so relatively quickly, right? Again, I keep reminding folks that it was just 2004, less than 20 years ago, that 61% of Ohioans voted for marriage between a man and a woman, and now here we are. It was just about 30 years ago, in 30 years ago exactly, in 1992, that Congress passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, that was sponsored by such conservatives, or voted for by such conservative stalwarts like Ted Kennedy and Joe Biden. So to see where we are today with this bill going through is a big deal. I actually want to start with what is actually the lesser issue, and then get to the bigger issue. The lesser issue here is actually religious freedom. That's not to say it's not massively important, but of the things about why we care, the lesser issue is actually religious freedom. And that was, that's what I very much applaud, and we were a part of the efforts to try to codify religious freedom protections in this, when it became clear that there were the votes to pass the same-sex marriage bill. It was absolutely the right strategy. We had to start focusing on, okay, so what can we do best to protect religious institutions? And I think Roger did a phenomenal job of walking those through. I'll say, it's something we're very concerned about, and we're going to be talking with both the members of our Christian Business Partnership, and our Christian Chamber of Commerce, of what this is going to mean for them in their employment practices, in their hiring. And again, not that anyone is discriminated against anybody right now, but even laws like this make it so that even the perception of a belief that might think that same-sex marriage, homosexuality is a sin, could open you up to litigation. Now, whether they win is one thing, but again, this is one of those things that even bringing the charge against somebody of discrimination is really damaging to a business, even if it ultimately gets beat. If it turns out that no one was being fired because they were gay or in a gay relationship, which again is not happening in Ohio or the nation. But the places I'm really concerned about in particular are, as Roger mentioned, adoption agencies, Christian schools. For our Ohio Christian Education Network, where schools say overtly, you must sign and live by our statement of faith to work here, is really at risk now under this bill, and these schools are at risk for litigation. What we've seen the left try to do is say, well, okay, and Roger pointed this out, and this is why the religious freedom protections, so-called protections that were in this bill, are meaningless. They're saying, well, yeah, we promise we're not going to go after the pastor or the chaplain to say they have to believe these things. But, what about the math teacher at your school? You can't say the math teacher has to believe or follow your biblical statement of faith, because they're just teaching math, and anybody should be able to do that. And anybody knows that works in Christian education and works in ministries that everybody involved in the process is a minister of the faith, is helping teach the values, along with whatever else sort of secular teaching they're doing, or maybe I wouldn't even call it secular. I would just call it non-controversial teaching that they're doing. All of that is a part of that Christian faith teaching. So that is certainly a major concern here. But Mike, I really think the big issue here, the one that we can't surrender talking about, and the one we have to continue to go back to, is the conversation of why marriage matters, why we think it's wrong for the government to codify same-sex marriage. And if I can, Mike, I want to just do a reprimer for everybody, because I think a lot of times what the conversation gets when we're talking about same-sex marriage, the conversation a lot of times boils down to, people think that Christians oppose same-sex marriage because we think homosexuality is a sin. And the reality is we do indeed think homosexuality is a sin, and is wrong, and is antithetical to human flourishing and thriving, just like a whole host of things are, right? But we're actually not in this discussion about same-sex marriage and homosexuality necessarily because we just think homosexuality is a sin. There's a lot of things that Christians think are sinful that we're not actively pushing to ban, right? We're not actively pushing to ban drunkenness, right? Sitting at home and getting plastered by yourself, right? We're not looking to ban that thing. There's no movement around that, but we are looking to say that marriage is between a man and a woman. We're actually far more concerned about saying what marriage is than what it's not. And the reason for that is we have to ask the fundamental question of why is government in the marriage business in the first place, right? You know, what you often hear around the same-sex marriage conversation is this debate around love is love, right? So why can't I be married to the person that I feel a lot of affection for and I love and I'm committed to? And you know, there's a really obvious and straightforward answer to that, right? And I think an analogy is a great picture, right? Mike, I love you, man. You're great. I'm so glad you joined the CCV team. I love you, right? I also,
Back at you, brother.
Exactly, right? I also, in a very different way, love my wife, right? I love Maria. She's amazing. And she's my best friend and all these things. So the question is, why does the government care about my relationship with Maria and not my relationship with you? And the reality is, because both of the nature of mine and Maria's love, but also fundamentally the nature of what our love and relationship can produce, which is children, that government has an interest in providing incentives. That's what all marriage policy is incentives for us to come together and stay together for life, right? Because there's something that can come out of our relationship that no matter how much I love you, Mike, can never come out of our relationship, right? And that is a biological tie to our children. And, you know, as soon as I say that, I know folks will automatically say, well, what about folks who are infertile, or what about folks who get married later in age and they can no longer have kids? The reality is that while not every man-woman relationship creates a child, every child is created by a man and a woman. And marriage policy on its whole, again, you're making policy for the macro, for society. Marriage policy is trying to focus on what is best for those kids, right? So every kid has a mother and a father. And that's really what when you understand the same-sex marriage debate, the gay marriage conversation, in the context of what's best for kids, and then you actually, instead of framing the gay marriage conversation in this broader sort of LGBT culture war, and you actually start viewing the gay marriage conversation in what I think is the bigger and more significant crisis, which is the attack on children, and more precisely putting the desires of adults over the needs of kids, you start to understand, oh, this is, and you look at the gay marriage conversation very much in the same conversation of what we're doing to schools, right? The COVID school closures, where we were saying, well, yeah, kids are going to lose out on education, but we have to protect the elderly, so we can't have kids in school. And now we've just let all these kids suffer and fall irreparably behind academically. When you start viewing, I mean, this is what abortion is, right? Abortion is putting the desires of adults over the needs of kids, all of these things. When you actually view this conversation in that lens, it makes a lot more sense of why Christians are so adamant about saying, no, listen, we actually, this is not about whether we care so much on a policy level of two men or two women committing to each other for the rest of their lives. If they want to do that, go for it. But this is more about what policies are we putting in place to ensure children have the best opportunity to succeed and have that very necessary tie to the biological man and woman that brought them into this world.
Right. And we're seeing a division here happen based on the idea that marriage is either about the happiness of the two people involved and their personal fulfillment versus, as you said, Aaron, something that produces offspring, and marriage then being an institution that allows for the rearing and the upbringing of that child in a safe, secure, stable environment. It's fundamental to the issue, really.
It is. And that right that children have to their biological father and mother, right? That there is, anybody that's a parent knows that and understands that. And I will say, this was something my wife and I've talked about this before on our podcast, The Narrative with David. This is something that, especially before my wife and I had kids, we really didn't understand. And it's hard to explain to folks until you go through that. And but it is something that most parents will understand inherently, which is that important bond between mother and father that can't be replaced. Again, that's not to say if kids don't have that tie to a mother and father, they're destined for failure, or that parents that have had one thing happen or another in their life are bad people because they're no longer together. But we're asking the question, what is best for kids? And it really is it's something that everybody knows inherently,
Yeah, and we had the opportunity last month in October to host John Stonestreet for an event about kids and culture. And I want to encourage everybody, if they didn't catch that episode of the Narrative podcast, when we aired the audio from that, there's some great content in there. But one of the things that John said is there's this lie that's been pervasive that the kids will be fine. The kids will be fine. The kids will be fine. And that goes all the way back to no-fault divorce. We're seeing it bleed into the same-sex marriage discussion, because it's not only do kids need a mom and a dad, it's do kids need loving parents. And we're still seeing the sociological data says that the best predictor of success for children is married mom and married dad.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right, Mike.
Yeah. So it's a big issue. And like I said, it's foundational. Like, we can't be silent on this because it's so important, not only for, I think, the church's witness, but just for the future of society and for our children, because we need man and woman relationships to produce the next generation. And I know that there are some issues and some possibilities there medically that haven't been there before that can help with that. But still, biologically, the way that I've explained it to my kids, and hopefully it's a way that they understand, is the way that I'm designed. I have my own nervous system. I have my own respiratory system. I have my own digestive system. I have a complementary reproductive system that requires the other complementary part of that in order to function the way that it should. So it's built into the biology of the way that God has created man and woman uniquely.
Amen. Amen. I see we got some questions, Mike. Do you want to dive into some of those?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's go over here. And if you have any, just make sure you open up that Q&A panel. Should be at the bottom of your screen, and you can type in your questions there. And a good one here, I think, that ties into what we just were talking about from Robert Tuttle is, Aaron, do you have any resources for finding the real data on the effects of same-sex parenting?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's been a lot more of that coming out in recent years. A lot of the early data, especially back when we were having the same-sex marriage debate, was the best data we had was on two-parent households, because we didn't really have wide amounts of data on same-sex parenting, on all those types of things. That now we're about 7 years into this experiment of redefining marriage, and I will tell you. The individual with the best data on this, that is continuing to come out with data and research, is a man by the name of Brad Wilcox, a professor from the University of Virginia. He does the Institute of Family Studies, and they come out with things all the time. They're actually doing a lot of great stuff right now as well on sort of the impact of school closures and things like that on kids. But it's phenomenally well done. And again, the highest level of quality and sort of peer review, those types of things. And so I would really recommend for folks that are interested in diving into this. And again, this data is still coming out more and more, and it is, it can't be said enough. This really is an experiment that we're doing on children and doing on the nation of redefining and reforming what family structure is. I do want to make one little thing here, and this is one of my little this is a little bee in my bonnet, if you will, that I always come back to. Obergefell and the so-called Respect for Marriage Act didn't legalize same-sex marriage, right? They use that language a lot. The media uses that language a lot. Advocates use that language. Oh, we legalize same-sex marriage. The problem with that concept of legalizing same-sex marriage, they're saying that's the same word they're using right now, phrase they'll use about marijuana, right? We're going to try to legalize recreational marijuana. That's a proper use of the term legalize, because right now marijuana for recreational use is illegal in the state of Ohio and in most states. Same-sex marriage was never illegal in terms of two same-sex individuals saying that they are committed to each other for life, right? What Obergefell did and what this bill did is it created same-sex marriage, right? So it created a new category. But a lot of times when folks use that phrase legalized, they're kind of painting a picture of government coming after people who are in same-sex unions. That wasn't happening. And this is where, again, language matters. And the way we talk about things matters. And it when we're saying legalize same-sex marriage, legalize gay marriage, it paints a picture that's not accurate for what's actually happening.
Yeah, and don't get me started on the word games that we can get into, because as you were talking when we first started this segment about religious freedom, one thing that you'll hear that spun, and I don't mean to get off on a tangent, is freedom of worship, and it sounds the same if you're not in tune to what's really going on. And what that is an attempt to do is say, oh yeah, well, we'll still give you that ability to do whatever you think is best for you in your home and in your church, just don't bring it into the public square. And right. We're saying the First Amendment gives us the right to exercise freely what we believe in the public square. And that's why these freedom issues are so crucial for the church and for believers. Let me combine a couple of questions here, Aaron, and this is going back to the bill itself. And I think one of these came in when we still had Roger on the line, so it may have been a little bit better suited for him, but I'm gonna let you take a crack at it, because I believe you can do it, brother. I think you got this. So just as far as the bill goes, if it's passed, is there anything that Congress can do to reverse it, or that's legislatively, judicially, is there anything that could happen in the Supreme Court that might render it unconstitutional or in conflict with those First Amendment issues that I just mentioned?
Yeah. So, I mean, the answer is yes. But the reality is, so functionally, yes, any bill can be approved, can be rather repealed by the same process that it goes through, right? This is why we turn out every election, right? Even things like the heartbeat bill here in Ohio, now we passed it. The same way we passed it, it could also be repealed. So we always have to be, sort of on our guard to do that. So that is a possibility. Practically speaking, completely repealing this is going to be very, very difficult. I think what Roger alluded to, our best sort of most immediate hope would be to eventually pass as standalone bills or as amendments into other things like the Lee Amendment. That gave just much more clarity on these things. Now, there's the separate question, the judicial question of, can eventually some of these things get struck down in court? And I think the answer is yes, in terms of the application of them, right? And so, does this guarantee that Christian schools or Christian ministries are going to be forced to hire people that don't affirm their statement of faith, or let's say Muslim schools or Jewish schools for that matter? No, it doesn't. Those questions will certainly, these questions are now to certainly be decided in court. And what you're going to have now is you're going to have an IRS, and you're going to have a civil rights department in states and federally that feel very emboldened to be going after these ministries. And I think one thing, we've become a very judicious society, and I know our friends at Alliance Defending Freedom would affirm this, of like, a lot of times folks see, oh, well, just go to court and fight for it. That is an awful process. And the courts weren't designed to take on this level and this much sort of persecution and have to decide these types of questions. And so the fight is certainly not over, both legislatively and judicially, certainly as well. And I think with the makeup of the Supreme Court right now, we will be in good shape to address some of these questions. But that's a long process, and there's going to be a lot of hurt and a lot of harm and a lot of heartache along the way to deciding those questions. I'll say right now we're keyed up, just so everyone keeps in mind, we're keyed up for a good conversation about this and potentially a good court win in the 303 creative case. And we'll do a little spoiler alert for everyone here. That case is being heard on Monday, December 5th, at the U.S. Supreme Court. And this is the case of a Colorado website designer who is suing the state of Colorado to not be forced to make wedding websites, same-sex wedding websites. She's a believer. Alliance Defending Freedom is defending her. And I'm looking forward to, I was blessed to be invited to go speak at the rally outside the Supreme Court on Monday. And so there will be a live stream of that. And we'll send that out to everybody with a bunch of different speakers, a lot of the attorneys from ADF. But we'll be out there at the rally, fighting for free speech and religious freedom and it's now that much more important with this bill having been passed.
We've got a few minutes left here, Aaron, and questions keep pouring in, and we've got some good people on our side, as these questions are outstanding the more that come in. So let me throw this one out to you. There's an argument that's been made, and I kind of alluded to it, that there's no difference between moms and dads, and you can have two moms and two dads and it's the same as long as it's a stable, loving environment. How do you respond to that, whether that's a same-sex couple wanting to have a child through adoption or through like an in vitro fertilization procedure?
Yeah, no, there's two aspects to that. One that is more biological, and another that is more sociological, if you will. So let's just talk about the biological one, and they're obviously very much tied together. The reality is that men and women, by and large, bring something very unique to a relationship. And so when you're creating same-sex marriage, when you're saying that there's no difference between these two, well, you're basically telling a child that you don't need nor have a right to your father, or you don't need nor have a right to your mother. And again, this is where we have to reframe this conversation, right? So the premise behind a question like this, and again, I'm not criticizing the person asking this. This is a tough question. The feelings of an adult, right? That's what the conversation here is. How do we not hurt the feelings of adults, because they want to be in these relationships too, and they want to rear children too, and all that, as opposed to starting from the point of what's best for that child. And this is, again, some of the IVF and artificial reproductive technology questions. Again, the premise that a lot of those things start with is how do we make adults feel better? And that's not necessarily a bad thing to want adults to feel better. But when we prioritize that over what's actually best for this kid, and denying the place that the fundamental reality that we know that every kid has that tie, that desire to be with the biological mother and father. I mean, think about all the movies, all the stories, all the books that have been written about kids feeling that inherent tug to know who their biological parents are. And when we do things like same-sex marriage, when we do things like this is the state saying, we are okay with telling a child, you don't have the right to your father, or you don't have the right to your mother. So there's that side of it. And again, we know inherently that that's wrong. Then there's the sociological data that just fundamentally shows on the whole, and again, this is macro. There's obviously lots of cases where this has been proven untrue in both ways on this, but on the whole, there's no denying that the data overwhelmingly shows this, is that the biological parents, the man and woman of a child, being with those individuals is far safer than anything else, right? So a stepfather or a stepmother, and again, I've got both, right? Personally, again, this was more as adults, but I don't say this to be derogatory towards stepmothers and stepfathers, but the data shows a stepmother and a stepfather are far more likely to be abusive towards a child than their biological parents, right? By far. Again, go look at Brad Wilcox's stuff. This is out there, right? And again, it makes sense that there's not as much tie. You didn't hold this child as a baby. There's a lot of things that's just common sense about this. And so when you're talking about what's the safest and best environment for the children, which again, when we're having these we're talking public policy here. We're not talking interpersonal relationships. We're talking about what we do as a society. That's the reason why we really care about these things.
Well, as we kind of bump up here in our last 2 to 3 minutes, Aaron, so much about this, I think, starts with the church. And this is a question of various versions of this came in. How do we encourage pastors, I think, first and foremost, to speak up, as Roger said, boldly about this? And what can we do to support the church in those efforts?
Yeah, absolutely. Really easy for the church. Preach the gospel. Preach the good news of Jesus Christ and his full counsel. And what I mean by that is, I know that sounds a little bit like, I want something more than that. Like, give me something real tangible, right? What's my action steps? What's my Sanctity of Life Sunday I could do? My voter registration Sunday I can do all those things. Those are great. But when we teach people, when we preach the gospel, we're teaching people that they were made for more than this world, and that their bodies are more than what the world is telling them. And that there is purpose and meaning behind God's perfect design. And when we first and foremost bring people into the love of, and I can testify this from my own personal testimony, right? I was brought into the church. I was brought into the love of Jesus Christ through the love of Jesus Christ. And then that love of Jesus Christ brought me to the place of pursuing his word and wanting to obey him because I love him so much and his word is so good. And so from the church's standpoint, if you're seeing this and you're like, oh, we've got to make a major shift, then we were probably doing something wrong in the first place, right? Let's be faithful to the gospel. Let's preach the word and bring people along. It's a lot easier to have the conversation around a biblical sexual ethic when you can start from the standpoints of our bodies and we were made for so much more than this, right? And so let's do that well. This is also a time for community, right? And for us to be together to support one another. People in the marketplace, people in ministry are terrified right now. And so we need to be supporting one another. This is the whole idea. It drives me crazy when I hear people say, I'm a Christian, but I just don't go to church. You can't do this life alone. We need each other. And the third thing is church pastors, you need to be teaching about the good news of Jesus Christ. And then teaching about these issues in particular through that lens, because the only place people today are going to hear a counter narrative about marriage, a counter narrative about children, a counter narrative about things like transgenderism is the church. Honestly, if you don't have that Holy Spirit, that spirit of grace, truth, and power, if you don't have that belief that we are more than conquerors through the Spirit of Jesus Christ, you will not, it's really hard to stand against these cultural tides. Yeah. And so the encouragement to pastors is to be talking about this, one, to educate their people and help people understand why these issues matter. This is what we're trying to do at CCV. to encourage pastors through this. I keep telling folks, some of you are going to get our year-end letter here very soon. We think these next few years are going to be huge. Like, we have such opportunity. And I know that sounds crazy with how dark things seem right now in our culture and our state. But at CCV, we're seeing massive opportunity to be salt and light and do huge things. And we're going on offense, right? This is offense only time for us right now. And again, Mike, you know this. We need people to be with us. We need your prayers. We need you to be coming out to our events, our Prayer at the State House events, be inviting us in, getting your Christian schools in OSUN, starting a school at your church, joining the Christian Business Partnership. And also here, as we're going into the year end, we need your financial support. We've got a $750,000 goal we've got to reach by the end of the year. And this isn't just some arbitrary number. This is the number we need to hit. We've had our best year already this year in CCV history. But we have massive goals we need to take on, massive challenges, and we can't do this without you. And so we want to invite people to be in, both to be praying, standing, and financially supporting us through the end of the year.
Yeah, and as far as spoiler alerts go, I'll also say for our supporters, you and I have a conversation planned in the next couple of weeks where we're going to talk about some of those opportunities that CCV has next year and ahead. So it's a good opportunity to find out exactly what's on the horizon, because I know as if it wasn't obvious from how you just said that, we're pretty excited about what God may have in store through CCV in the state of Ohio, ultimately for his good in the coming year.
Amen. Amen.
Well, Aaron, we're out of time. Thanks so much. This has been a great conversation. Again, I want to thank Roger Severino and most of all of our attendees and participants today. This has been a great conversation. I hope you found it beneficial and edifying. And we wish you a very Merry Christmas and happy Advent season to all of our friends out there. God bless, grace and peace to you.